Hey guys, my name is Megan Sadler and my project partner's name is Rebecca Seeger, and for our senior Bible final, we chose to talk about the topic of predestination and how it came about by Augustine the philosopher, who wrote the book Augustine's Confessions. So, what is predestination? And how did Augustine even come up with this idea? Well, there are three distinct events in the Confessions book that Rebecca and I found, when combined, explain how Augustine came to this conclusion that is predestination. Those three things are grace, certain events that happened in his life, which then led to why he thought this. Now, what I just said may sound confusing, which is totally normal. Just know that this is not an easy concept for anyone to just pick up and understand. The only reason that me and Rebecca understand this is because we learned about the background of this certain philosopher and what he had to go through in his lifetime to understand predestination. So for you to understand this concept, just like we did, we're going to give you a brief background of Augustine's life. Starting with his family, Augustine had a father named Patricius, or more commonly known as Patrick, who was a minor Roman official. His father was in charge of commanding a troop of at least 10 men in case of any war, and was required to act as a patron for his community, which meant if the taxes for his community were not met, his father had to come up with the money some other way, which is why in Augustine's earlier days, he refers to his family as poor. His mother, on the other hand, whose name was Monica, was a die-hard Christian, whose only goal that we know of was to raise her children to be Christian like her. Against Patrick's wishes, who was not a Christian, he allowed Monica to raise Augustine in the church as she wished. As Augustine began to go to school, he had a distinct catch to him that he and his parents realized. Augustine's father soon saw that his son was brilliant and could have a chance at going to higher education in the public field and gaining lots of money. His mother, on the other hand, was completely against his wishes and asked for him to stay out of the public. In the end, Augustine's father saved up all the money for him to go to a school in higher education. The last distinct part of Augustine's life that he talks about in his Confessions is his culture and lifestyle. Augustine chose to live his life defining what his culture told him to do. He would go and steal with his quote-unquote friends and would sin for the sake of sinning. An example of this is living with a concubine and having a child with her, or like when he was younger, stealing pears just because he could steal them. So now that you know a little more about Augustine, let's get back to predestination. The definition of predestination is the divine foreordaining of all that will happen, especially with regard to the salvation of some and not others. So what does this definition mean? And why does it bring up so many questions like, is free will really free then? This question of, is free will really free then, was brought on by Augustine when he really began to dive into how does this work. With predestination, God has already chosen those who will be saved. You could have accepted him in your heart at the very beginning of your life, the very end, or somewhere even in between. The person could have been a saint or a terrible person who, even to the extent, killed other Christians. Regardless of what they did though, predestination means you are bound for something, whether that's going to heaven or hell. So that leaves us with the thought of, if I'm not predestined to go to heaven, does that mean I can do whatever I want? And the flip side of that is, if I am predestined to go to heaven, is there anything I could do that won't get me there then? The key thing Augustine really wanted to hit home in his Confessions was that predestination cannot be without grace. So how does grace tie into this then? Grace is an invitation that God has given us to become one of his children. And everybody is given grace, but what we do with it is our choice. You may be predestined to go to heaven, but decline his grace and invitation in your adolescence like Augustine did, but accept it later in life. Just because you choose differently doesn't mean you didn't end up at the same place though. Think of it like this. You are a fish in the sea of life. You may change pathways throughout your life, and you may go right a little and then a lot left. But at the very end, you still ended up at the same place you were destined to be. And who is to say that we aren't all predestined to go to heaven? No one but God knows who truly goes there in the end. So we come to the final conclusion about Augustine and predestination, and how this all became from his beliefs. It was mostly because of 7 distinct events in his life that brought him to this. The first being the baptism of his dying friend. Then the teachings and philosophies of rhetoric, Monica's visions for Augustine, which led him to move to Rome, listening to Ambrose, the struggles he had in the garden, and last, his conversion to Christianity. Had these things not happened, Augustine wouldn't have led to the next step. If Augustine hadn't had those struggles, he wouldn't have moved on, he wouldn't have made the books, and we wouldn't be where we are right now. He was predestined to have these things happen, but he had the choice to change whether he wanted to or not. We hope you learned a thing or two, and if you have any questions, we do recommend reading the Confessions book of Augustine of Hippo, or just Google it, whichever one works for you.